have no right to life. You can determine if they live or die. You have that power in you under law to make that decision. This person is your property to dispose of it as you see fit. Complete and total power under law. That is chattel slavery. And that system was put in place only in respect of African peoples. If you go to the British Museum and go into the Roman exhibition, you will see a coin and a bust of a man called Severus Septimus. Severus Septimus was a slave in the Roman Empire. He was a slave. He was a slave to the Caesar. But he was also a general in the army. He was also one of the most prominent men in Rome, with a massive army under his control. But under the laws of Rome, he was a slave because he was owned by the Caesar. But as a slave, he had powers, he has authority, he had the right to his family, he had the right to a large home, but he was just called a slave because he owed service to the Caesar. That kind of slavery is altogether very different from what we are talking about, which is chattel slavery. And Severus Septimus was the general who led the Roman army to conquer Britain. And it's interesting because Severus Septimus, African general, led the army to conquer Britain, wrote back to the Caesar and said, we're not going to take any slaves from Britain because these people are malnourished and very weak. But that is the tide of history.
Thank you. We have two last questions. Yes, go ahead with your question. In the meantime, I'm asking somebody from the press, UWI, to come and tell students the website or the email address where others can send their questions, and you can forward those to Professor Beckles so they can get their answers. Final questions. Make them short, please. What is the name of your school and your name?
Given the vision of this reparation, when the letters reach a relevant authority, would this be something long-standing where we have to wait a long time before we get compensation? Because remember in the story of the Amistad with the slaves who did not have a voice, but yet still their cases were tried in the American High Court, and they did one, knowing that these persons were illiterate persons who could not read and understand English doctrine. So will it be something long-standing, or is this a base decision we're sitting on?
All right, so that's about timeline.
I think that is a very important and profound question. Well, you would have heard Member of Parliament Mike Henry make the statement not too long ago. He said for 40 years he has been in this struggle in his political career. This struggle goes back to slavery. The enslaved people were saying, we want reparations. When emancipation came, they were saying, we want reparations. 100 years later, and here we are 180 years later, and we are still insisting upon it. Now, the reasons why you are here, the reason you are here to say, no matter how long it takes, we are not giving up. That's the point. Now, specifically, when the governments of the Caribbean and the governments of Europe get together in their normal environments of diplomacy, I have no idea how long that negotiation will take. I have no idea. It might take a year, it might take less. It might take 5 years. These are governments that are going to be talking to each other about the details of this, the mechanisms, the modalities. It's an intergovernmental conversation. I cannot tell you how long that will take, but I will tell you this. Weak people and weak nations do not get reparations. All the cases of reparations in the last 100 years have been won by people who are determined, who are organized, by governments who are committed, and by people who have pride and self-esteem. If you do not have organization, if you do not have pride, if you do not have dignity in yourself, If you do not have governments that are going to stand with you, you will not get it. That is what history has shown. So it is really a function of you, the people, and your governments that will determine how long this process will take.
Good morning. Usually I'm speaking some college. Now, I'm wondering, have we carefully considered the social, political, legal ramifications that this proposal will have on the metropolitan relationship between United Kingdom and peripheral countries like Barbados, Jamaica, etc.?
Yes, that's good. Let me deal with that. It is very important, as you have said, that reparations ought to be discussed in an environment of civility. You've heard the principal speak about the need to be civil while we're having a conversation. When the governments of the Caribbean meet with the governments of Europe, in the interest of diplomacy, in the interest of the future, conciliation, atonement, that conversation should be at the highest level of philosophy and of concern. You make your case for justice, they will respond. You make your case for justice, they will respond. Now, if you argue that you are fearful of the consequences, that if you argue for reparations, you might get a backlash. If you argue for reparations, the governments of Europe might respond to your requests with aggression and animosity and will hurt your potential. Look at the history. Emancipation generated a fair amount of conflict, you would agree. Emancipation, the decision to bring freedom, the governments of Europe did not want to give us freedom. There were people who were saying, philosophers, economists, politicians, the enslaved themselves were saying, freedom is the right thing. The governments were saying, no, we will not give you freedom. Other people said, no, we have to get freedom. It's a right thing, it's a human thing, and freedom took 30 years of political debate. 1 second. Then 100 years later, we came to independence. They were not keen to give us independence either. But we had leaders who stood up and said, the time has come for us to be independent. The governments of Europe did not wish to give us independence, but we stood our ground and demanded independence. Now here we are, 50 years after independence, and we're saying, okay, the next stage is reparations. We want reparations. So no doubt, you should expect them to say, we will not give you reparations. So we will not give you emancipation, we will not give you independence, we will not give you reparations, but you have to stand your ground.
I'm very sorry, we can only allow the final two. Yes, next. Huh? He's yielding his ground? Okay.
From what I understand from what you're saying is that we're not just only asking for repatriation, for emotional, psychological damage.
Yes.
That word, yes. We're asking them to cancel debts as well. So that is why I asked the question a while ago. It's not just psychological, intellectual, emotional. We're asking them to cancel our debts.
Yes. The point you're making is a good one, and here is the argument. They will say to you that your nations have established a debt profile, and why should we take the responsibility for your debt? They will say that. And you will say, but we have inherited a mess that you have left behind. After 300 years, you have left these societies in a mess. And now we have been trying to deal with them to uplift the people, and now we have this enormous debt. Now, one issue before us is that concept of debt cancellation. Now, you heard from Mike Henry that says the simple repayment of the 20 million pounds that was given to the slave owners might be the framework within which all of these matters can be settled. And maybe the 20 million, which represents the $76 billion, will cover all of these issues going forward. That is also possible as a framework. It is up to the societies and the governments to frame the conversation. But there will be financial issues involved, social issues, psychological issues, which is important. So yes, you are spot on. How do we ask governments of Europe to dig into their treasury and make resources available to societies that they wish to be rid of. That is the power of diplomacy. And Jamaica has many very distinguished diplomats who can negotiate their way through this issue.